What if I told you that the first capital of the United States was once a burned-out, divided port clinging to the edge of Manhattan? Welcome to Stone and Smoke History. I am Steve Harvey, and today I want to take you somewhere raw, uncertain, and deeply human. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you do not miss the stories still to come. Some of the visuals you will see are symbolic and may not perfectly match each detail, and we truly appreciate your understanding. Now, take a breath, settle in, and let us step back into a New York reborn from ashes. If you had stood at the southern tip of Manhattan in 1783, just after the British evacuation, you would not have seen a triumphant metropolis. You would have seen a wounded town trying to remember who it was. For 7 years, New York had served as the principal British military headquarters in North America. When the last ships departed in November 1783, they left behind a place marked by occupation, division, and visible ruin. Yet, in the years that followed, from 1785 to 1790, this same town became the first capital of the United States. For viewers in America, Britain, Australia, Canada, or across Europe, the first surprise would be the city's size. New York, in the 1780s, was almost entirely confined to the southern edge of Manhattan. It stretched barely a mile north from the Battery. Beyond that lay open land, scattered farms, rocky rises, and stretches of countryside that would feel closer to rural Europe than to modern Midtown. This was not yet a skyline. It was a compact port town facing an uncertain future. The scars of the Great Fire of 1776 were still present. Roughly a quarter of the city's buildings had been destroyed during the early days of the war. Even years later, empty lots, half-rebuilt structures, and temporary wooden dwellings interrupted the streetscape. The memory of smoke and displacement lingered in the physical layout of the town. Recovery was slow, practical, and visible. And yet something remarkable happened. Between 1785 and 1790, New York hosted the new national government. In 1789, at Federal Hall on Wall Street, George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. In that moment, this small, scarred port became the political heart of a new republic. A city once defined by imperial rule began redefining itself as the stage for American self-government. If you had walked through New York in the 1780s, the first thing you would have noticed was how physical daily life felt. The streets were narrow and uneven, paved with rough cobblestones that made every step deliberate. There were no sidewalks in the modern sense. People, carts, horses, and livestock all moved through the same shared space. It was crowded, noisy, and intensely alive in a way that would surprise anyone used to today's ordered traffic. Animals were not just present, they were part of the city's basic functioning. Pigs roamed freely through the streets, feeding on refuse. Horses stood tethered outside homes and taverns. In a practical sense, these animals acted as a form of waste control in a time before organized sanitation. The smells, the mud, and the sounds were constant companions to urban life. The climate added another layer of hardship. The late 18th century fell within what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures across the North Atlantic world. Winters could be long and unforgiving. The winter of 1780 was especially severe. Contemporary accounts describe New York Harbor freezing solid. Ice stretched thick enough to allow heavy carts and even military movements to cross between Manhattan and Staten Island. For a maritime city dependent on its port, a frozen harbor was more than dramatic. It was a reminder of how vulnerable daily life remained to the forces of nature. If the streets of New York felt raw and physical, the waterfront felt electric. The city's survival depended on the sea. Its economy rested firmly on maritime trade, and the busiest activity centered along the wharves of the East River, whose sheltered waters were better suited for docking ships than the more exposed Hudson. This was the true engine of the city. When you imagine the harbor in the 1780s, picture a forest of masts rising above the shoreline. Merchant vessels crowded the docks, unloading sugar, rum, tea, textiles, and other goods that tied New York to the Caribbean, Britain, and the wider Atlantic world. Traders negotiated prices in counting houses. Brokers and ship captains moved between taverns and warehouses, turning information into opportunity. Commerce was constant, competitive, and intensely personal. With wealth came reputation. Observers at the time often described New Yorkers as ambitious, sharp-tongued, and sometimes lacking in restraint. The language of the docks was blunt and frequently profane. Sailors, merchants, and speculators lived in close quarters, and the culture reflected that rough edge. To some outsiders, especially those shaped by stricter moral traditions, the city seemed driven more by profit than by principle. Yet this restless energy also fueled its rapid growth. The same commercial hunger that critics questioned was the force transforming a war-scarred port into a rising center of Atlantic trade. By the mid-1770s, New York had also earned a reputation that troubled many of its leaders. Contemporary accounts suggest that in 1776, there were roughly 500 prostitutes operating in the city, a striking number for a town of its size. Much of this activity was concentrated in an area informally known as Holy Ground, a district associated with brothels, taverns, and frequent disorder. Violence was not uncommon. Fights broke out, tensions escalated quickly, and military authorities worried about discipline among the troops. George Washington, who first brought the Continental Army into New York in 1776, viewed the city with deep concern. He feared that the temptations of gambling, prostitution, and heavy drinking would weaken morale and undermine the army's moral character. In response to unrest and incidents involving soldiers, strict controls were imposed. Curfews and tighter supervision became necessary in order to maintain order within the ranks. For Washington and other officers shaped by more restrained social norms, New York felt dangerously permissive. Critics described the city as irreverent and overly proud. Visitors complained about open profanity, casual blasphemy, and what they saw as a culture driven by profit rather than virtue. Gambling houses flourished. Sailors and merchants spoke with a bluntness that unsettled more pious observers. To some, especially those influenced by Protestant moral discipline in Britain and New England, New York seemed spiritually careless. Yet this reputation also reflected its diversity and commercial energy. A port city drawing people from across the Atlantic world was bound to feel less controlled and less uniform. What some called corruption, others might have recognized as the turbulence of a fast-moving society. One of the most complex and human stories of New York in this era concerns enslaved people who sought freedom during the war. In 1779, the Philipsburg Proclamation, issued by the British commander Sir Henry Clinton, promised freedom to enslaved people owned by American rebels if they escaped to British lines. For many men and women living in bondage, this was not an abstract political document. It was a chance, however uncertain, to claim control over their own lives. As a result, New York became what some later described as an island of freedom in a wider landscape shaped by slavery. Thousands of formerly enslaved people made their way to the city during the British occupation. They worked as laborers, servants, soldiers, and skilled workers in support of the British war effort. Freedom was never simple or fully secure. But compared to plantation life, New York offered a radically different horizon. When the war ended and the British prepared to evacuate in November 1783, American slaveholders came to the city demanding the return of people they considered their property. British officers refused to hand over those who had been granted freedom under earlier proclamations. Detailed records were compiled to document who would be evacuated. This was not a chaotic departure. It was an organized effort to prevent re-enslavement. Many black loyalists left with the British fleet, traveling to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or later to Sierra Leone. At the same time, it is important to remember that New York had also been the site of immense suffering. American prisoners of war were confined on British prison ships, anchored in Wallabout Bay, where thousands died from disease and neglect. The city embodied both hope and tragedy. In its streets and harbor, the struggle for liberty unfolded in deeply unequal and often painful ways. Even after more than a century under British rule, the Dutch legacy of the earlier colony of New Amsterdam remained deeply embedded in New York's character. If you had wandered through the lower part of Manhattan in the 1780s, you would have noticed that the streets did not follow a rigid grid. They curved and twisted in irregular patterns, reflecting the older Dutch layout that predated British control. The physical map of the city still carried the imprint of its 17th century origins. Architecture told the same story. Alongside English brick buildings stood structures influenced by Dutch design, with steep roofs and practical forms suited to a trading port. The blending of styles was not simply aesthetic, It reflected generations of families who had adapted to changing political authority while remaining rooted in the same place. Marriage records from the late 17th and early 18th centuries show high levels of intermarriage between people of different European backgrounds. English settlers often married Dutch women, and over time, a multi-ethnic European population emerged. By the 1780s, identity in New York was rarely defined by a single national origin. It was layered, blended, and shaped by the Atlantic world. Religious life also reflected this openness. From its earliest days as a Dutch trading post, the city had practiced a degree of religious tolerance unusual for its time. Jewish communities, various Protestant denominations, and other groups found space to worship. Combined with its commitment to international trade, this tradition of pluralism helped form a civic culture that felt cosmopolitan long before the word became fashionable. When the British evacuated New York in 1783, they did not leave behind the same social order they had governed. Many wealthy loyalists, along with prominent Anglican clergy and officials tied to imperial administration, departed with the fleet. Their exit reshaped the city's hierarchy. Property changed hands, political influence shifted. Institutions once aligned with royal authority had to redefine themselves within a republic. For ordinary residents, this transition created uncertainty, but also opportunity. Without the dominance of loyalist elites, ambitious merchants, artisans, and professionals from more modest backgrounds found new space to advance. The structure of power became more fluid. Economic success and civic participation were no longer tied as tightly to loyalty to the crown. The departure of established figures opened doors that had previously seemed closed. In a remarkably short span of time, New York moved from being viewed as a stronghold of Tory sentiment to serving as the seat of the new federal government. Streets that had once hosted imperial officials now welcomed delegates, lawmakers, and national debates. Coffee houses and taverns became arenas for political discussion. Newspapers circulated arguments about federal authority, state rights, finance, and the meaning of citizenship. If you imagine standing there in the late 1780s, you would sense a city thinking aloud. People were not only rebuilding homes and businesses, they were wrestling with what it meant to be American. Identity was no longer defined by allegiance to Britain, yet it was not fully settled either. In that restless conversation, New York became more than a recovering port. It became a laboratory for Republican life in the Atlantic world. New York in the 1780s was a small city with enormous ambition. It was scarred by fire and war, yet determined to rebuild. It was growing wealthy through trade, even as many questioned its moral character. It was remarkably diverse for its time, yet still bound to the reality of slavery. It carried the pain of conflict, and at the same time it witnessed the birth of a republic. For me, this story is not just about buildings or politics. It is about people learning how to redefine themselves after upheaval. I would love to hear your thoughts. Do you see this decade as fragile or powerful? Share your perspective in the comments. And if this journey meant something to you, subscribe and continue exploring history with us.